This semester, I'm going to be teaching a course on early modern Catholicism, as I say, roughly from the late 14th to the early 18th centuries. This is a course which I have taught since the mid-1970s. And it's it's an upper division course at the University of Iowa, and it's part of a sequence that I offer on early modern Catholicism, and then the Protestant Reformation, and then thirdly, religion and violence in early modern Europe. Please understand, my primary research focus is French Protestantism, but I've long been interested in Catholicism as well and have long taught this course. The course, Early Modern Catholicism, essentially explores the transition of Catholicism from a relatively diverse and centralized medieval Christian community to a very highly structured and unified Roman Catholic Church. I put a lot of emphasis upon sort of understanding ordinary people's religious beliefs, their devotional behavior, their liturgical practices, and indeed, for a largely rural and peasant culture, the sort of what we would call this hybrid religion that they practiced, which was a blend of official Christianity with folk traditions. That is really the first topic of the course. And then that sort of segues naturally into some discussion of what happened at the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century and how the bishops and others sought really to explain with great precision, that had probably not existed prior to then, exactly what it is that Catholics believe, what they issued these precise doctrinal statements, and they also enacted encompassing disciplinary regulations. And that then becomes the blueprint, the platform for addressing these other issues. How do they address those other issues? Well, they do so, it seems to me, really in two fundamental ways. One is through education and preaching, and even missionary work internal to Europe. And the other, sometimes somewhat more coercive, the use of judicial forms, and most sort of horrifically, the Inquisition. So once we know what people believe, once we know how this caused concern in the hierarchy, then it seems to me the next issue that we deal with in the course are the emergence of new religious orders. And here I'm thinking principally of the Jesuits among men and the Ursuline nuns among women. And others, but both of these spectacular groups were particularly involved in education, in social welfare, in missionary work, and at least for the Jesuits, political, I suppose some would say political intrigue. I think that leads then in its turn to some attempt to understand the missionary fervor that accompanied early modern Catholicism. There are missions to the rural world in Europe itself. And I think most interestingly, there are these missions to Asia and the Americas. The Jesuits and others fanned out across Asia. In French Canada, it was not simply Jesuits, but it was Ursuline nuns as well who arrived there and who really attempt to spread the news of Catholicism. To begin, I grew up Catholic, and that fostered a very deep interest in the development of Catholic religious beliefs and Catholic practices. I suppose, as I grew older and reflected upon it, I was very taken by the nature of shared piety, of what people did in the pews and how they related to what the priests and others were doing. Then, as an undergraduate and graduate student from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s, I was very much influenced by the Second Vatican Council and the sort of call to re-examine the Catholic Church, not in its fundamental beliefs, certainly, and not even in its fundamental liturgical practices, but in how it understood itself and how it had developed. And so that led me to an interest in sort of exploring the history of Catholicism. Remember, it seems to me that Catholics have a very strong sense of their historical roots. They're very proud of their historical roots. And it occurred to me that, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, at the height of the ecumenical movement, it might be worthwhile to investigate that a little bit and to sort of talk about it with students and others. Well, I think the students, how should I put this, do not have quite as critical an understanding of the subject as, I mean, I'm not blaming them by any stretch of the imagination. I just think it's natural. And I think there's a tendency among the general public to view Catholicism as far more monolithic and far more unified than it was, or for that matter, is even today. There's a sort of multiplicity there's a range of understanding, let me put it that way. And I think secondly, there is a sense that in many ways Catholicism has changed very little since the High Middle Ages. When you talk to Catholic students and even people who have graduated, there is the sense that the Middle Ages, that's us, that's who we are. And without the realization that a lot of things have evolved, let me put it that way, over the course of time. I would hope that they understand that contemporary Catholicism is very much indebted to its historical development in early modern Europe. Despite the general sense of a continuity of Catholicism from the Middle Ages to the present, the early modern period, the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, witnessed profound changes. The centralization of ecclesiastical institutions and institutional structures, the reinforcement of core beliefs, the uniformity of liturgical practices, and globalization through missionary efforts in India, China, Japan, and the Americas. By the end of the early modern period, I'm not saying that there's a change in belief structures or a change in institutional character, but I do think there are these shifts that to a more global Catholicism, to a more structured Catholicism, to a more transparent Catholicism. Invariably, I have the students read Ignatius Loyola's autobiography. I think that's a key text. It's a key text for understanding how prominent figures in early modern Catholicism combine mysticism and activism. If you've ever read it, it's an impressive account of a man who is both a mystic and very active in the ordinary daily world. And I think that really helps students understand the enthusiasm and the particular paths which this took. I sometimes supplement that with missionary accounts, something like the accounts of Jean de Boisboeuf of his experience with Native Americans in Canada, or Matteo Ricci's letters, on his attempts to convert the Chinese. So there's good material for men. There's less for women's participation. And so what I generally have students do is read Natalie Davis's superb study of a French Ursuline woman, Marie de l'Incarnation. In the 17th century, she essentially is married at a very young age, widowed with a small child, a son, at within a year or two, and becomes increasingly interested in this rigorous physical asceticism that she understood to be the sort of height of her Catholic faith. She eventually will, perhaps the word is forsake her son. She leaves her son with her older sister and enters an Ursuline convent, and then ultimately separates herself completely from Europe, sails across to Quebec City, and spends most of her adult life in a convent, but really a school for young Native American girls, and sort of acculturating them to European religion, but European culture generally, I think so. And anyway, in my estimation, both Ignatius Loyola and Marie de l'Incarnation exemplify important characteristics of early modern Catholic piety, the sense of one can forsake the family one can and perhaps ought to engage in severe asceticism with physical mortification. That there is this sense of missionary zeal. I mean, Loyola goes off to Palestine. He doesn't get to stay there very long, but his goal in some ways was to convert the Muslims. And so certainly Marie de l'Incarnation, her mission in life becomes the conversion of Native American women, and hopefully send them back to their villages where they will spread the good news. I'm not absolutely convinced that my assignments are innovative, but I have them write two major essays based on things we've read and talked about and analyzed. And so the first writing assignment is really to be a comparative analysis probing the nature of early modern Catholic piety as exemplified by Ignatius Loyola in his autobiography and life, what he tells us about himself, and Marie de l'Incarnation. And there are many similarities, and there are some profound differences. And I think in that way, the students begin to appreciate how people understood their faith and how they acted upon it. And then we read and discuss Carlo Ginzburg's groundbreaking study of the intersection of oral culture, peasant culture, and literate culture, the official ecclesiastical culture of the Roman Catholic Church. In his sort of seminal study, The Cheese and the Worms, Ginzburg lays out the story of this Italian miller, a man by the name of Minocchio, who grew up in the oral culture, but who somehow or another learned to read. I'm not sure how, but he did become literate. And we know exactly what books he read, and we know how he understood them and how he interpreted them. And for someone who was a member of the literate culture, it made no sense whatsoever. But it is his interrogators, his judges, because he's deemed absolutely dangerous. But his judges understand that he's a danger, don't understand what he's saying, but are absolutely convinced that this has to be dealt with and dealt with very firmly. And my point is that we have here a window into this hybrid religious culture, this sense that, yes, there is a veneer of Christianity, but beneath it lies a bedrock of folk beliefs that someone like Ginzburg would say go back, stretch earlier than Christianity itself. And so it's provocative in many ways and on many levels. And I know at least one of my students, I'll count this as a blessing, said it's the best book she ever read. So I'm not advocating everyone pick this book up and read it, but I think in terms of trying to understand European culture and linguistic, if you will, cultural differences and how they affect religious beliefs, I think it's a great assignment, and I've always enjoyed reading student responses. But let me preface my remarks to this by pointing out that I am a product of K through 12, and then 4 years undergraduate of Catholic education, in particular Jesuits as an undergraduate. And so my first experience really with public education was when I went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin. And I would say there and later, particularly at the University of Iowa, it's imperative that all religious positions are respected. My task is to explain. I'm not an advocate, nor ought I to disparage either, but rather to take what I would call as neutral an approach as possible. Secondly, I would point out that I have discovered that you can never assume students have more than a passing familiarity with Catholicism. In my course on early modern Catholicism, most of the students come from a Catholic background, though it's not something I ask. I get a sense of it over time when they ask questions and shake their heads or nod no. So I don't assume that they know much about Catholicism, or for that matter, Christianity. I recall very vividly the first time I taught this course, in the first week, this young man in the back turned out to be a very bright guy. His hand shut up and he said, "I don't understand. What is a sacrament? he really wasn't, and it hadn't occurred to me that someone taking a course on early modern Catholicism would not understand what a sacrament is. So you have to be cautious about that. I think you have to be very careful about that. The course has changed substantially in response, it seems to me, to important developments that have occurred within early modern Catholic studies since the mid-1970s. The field overall has flourished in a way and to a degree that I would never have anticipated. It's become it's mainstream. Let me put it that way. I think of the work particularly of someone like John O'Malley, who has challenged us to discard labels such as counter-Reformation or even Catholic Reformation. It's John O'Malley who has really made the term early modern Catholicism popular. In his view, it confers a kind of a much better sense of the integrity and the authenticity of early modern Catholicism. So that's one thing to know, the sort of general prosperity of scholars of early modern Catholicism. Secondly, I think our understanding of the role and the place of women in early modern Catholicism has dramatically advanced. And here I'm struck by the work of people like Natalie Davis or Mary Wiesner Hanks, among others, who have contributed substantially to addressing important issues in the study of early modern Catholicism. There's been a flurry of books written in the past decade on new religious orders, female orders, such as the Ursulines or the Daughters of Charity, and the way in which they dedicated themselves to setting up schools or to engaging in poor relief. We now understand that, for example, the Daughters of Charity avoided becoming an official religious order because they would have been cloistered under the guidelines laid out by Trent, and they wanted to work in the streets to help poor women in particular, women in distress. And so I think that's been really, if I can use the word, a bit of a revelation, has added immeasurably to the course. And finally, the field has adopted, as I have already suggested, it has adopted a more global approach. The effects of missionary activity, accompanied by horrific colonial practices and cultural imperialism, have become important subjects of recent historical analyses. And here I'm thinking of studies of someone like Bartolomé de las Casas and his plea for toleration of indigenous people in the Americas, or the analysis of the career of Matteo Ricci, this Italian Jesuit who ends up in China and attempts, with a little bit of frustration, I might say, to convert the Chinese. I would, as you have just mentioned, my research and publication program focuses on French Reform Protestantism. And I'm particularly interested in the way in which French Protestants sought to affect church discipline, sought to foster approved, quote unquote, Christian behavior, at least what they perceived to be proper Christian behavior. And so as a result, I continually find valuable comparisons and contrasts with developments in the Catholic orbit. I don't think that they are so far apart as to not feed and inform one another, or at least in the scholarship. So, for example, I recently contributed a chapter to a collection of essays comparing the work of the Catholic Inquisition with Reformed Protestant morals tribunals, so-called consistories. And what I discovered in the course of not only writing my chapter, but reading the chapters of my fellow contributors, was that there are striking similarities in their goals, their objectives, even in the way in which they conduct themselves. There are some differences, there's no doubt about that. The Inquisition's interested in slightly different moral delinquencies and divergences of belief than, say, the Protestant morals courts. But their approaches to correction and their assessment of what needs to be done, I find it totally absorbing. It was a delight. It was an absolute delight. And so in the end, I remain profoundly fascinated by the religious transformations, global transformations that took place in early modern Europe. And I think that early modern Catholicism really continues to hold a very deep attraction for me.